All right, so a couple of announcements before we get going. There will be a couple of blog posts. Which particular blog? The Rotman blog.
The Rotman blog, yeah.
Not any blog in general, but Rotman blog. So stay tuned.
We're going to try to capture aspects of the meeting itself and then aspects of what happened in the regular sessions in here, just as a reference. So just we'll set around a link, but stay tuned for that.
And secondly, Colin Klein at Macquarie in Sydney is organizing and editing a special issue of the journal Philosophical Explorations on these issues. I don't know when the ad will be, but the notice will be, but it's a few months out.
Yeah,
probably 6 months.
There's a call for papers, and we can send that around as well. So just stay tuned.
So if you have a paper on this topic and you have a place to send it, that's a good place. All right. So when are we stopping? On the hour? Pretty much. Yeah.
Aim for that. Yeah.
We'll aim for that. Okay. So what we're going to do now is just do a little bit of a summary for each of the groups. And people should feel free to pitch in as and when. So I'll kick off with what we talked about in our group, and because I can't think without writing, I'm going to write. So I think our discussion focused on 3 issues. Well, let's not talk about pluralism yet. One thing we sort of finished with actually is the thought that there are plural taxonomies, multiple taxonomies in the psychological realm. So we talked about the relationship between 3 such taxonomies. There's, as it were, and indulge me here because I'm going to be simplistic, there's the taxonomy of folk psychology. There's what you might call scientific psychology. And then there's our discussion focused on the 3rd taxonomy, that of psychiatry, and the taxonomy that DSM works with and our doctor's looking to improve on. And there's questions about the relationship between these 3 taxonomies, and questions about the degree to which we should expect them to be answerable to each other, whether they have some kind of autonomy. And an issue in the background here is whether they're in, whether we should expect them to do different jobs for us, whether they should be answerable to different norms. So discussions of folk psychology traditionally got going with thinking about folk physics, and when it comes to considering the relationship between physics and folk physics, people have tended to think that they're in the same business. They're in the business of describing the physical structure of the world. And you might think that folk psychology and scientific psychology are in the same business in the way that physics and folk physics are in the same business. So there really should be, we should bring them into alignment. We really should. If scientific psychology goes in one direction, we should change our folk psychology. Another way of thinking about folk psychology is it's in a different kind of business. It's not in the business of articulating the structure of the mind in the same way. It's a way of understanding people. It's a way of predicting their behavior, and that doesn't require articulating the structure of the mind in the same way that scientific psychology does. So, I mean, that's an important set of issues because the way in which you might illuminate constructs in scientific psychology might not apply directly to the way in which you might illuminate constructs in folk psychology. So there are big issues there that we just touched on, but might be worth people thinking about in more detail. We also talked about the relationship between psychiatry and scientific psychology, and some people were suggesting that maybe the constructs of psychiatry are not answerable to quite the same norms that the constructs of scientific psychology are, and some people in our group thought that there really ought to be a very close connection here, which is sort of the approach that our doc seems to be pursuing. So the question about what kind of jobs these taxonomies are doing is important for a related question of pluralism, the thought that each of them might be legitimate, that they're not actually competing versus kind of a competitive conception where one thinks that if they, as it were, are at odds with each other, one of them's got to go, the other one's construct, and one has to go if the other one has to stay. So that's one set of issues. Another set of issues that we've talked about concerned issues that you might distinguish between internalism and externalism. And the big overarching question, at least as I see it, is whether our categories are individuated in terms of environmental relations, or whether they're, as it were, simply categories that ought to be answerable only to brain structure and neural structure. So we saw that in some of the talks, people are, as it were, assuming that taxonomizing ought to be done only on the basis of internal information. Other people in the talks during the weekend have suggested that at least some constructs are individuated in terms of relations. And there was an interesting discussion in our group as some people thought this was obviously the right way to go for all, as it were, psychological constructs, and other people seem to think that this is obviously the right way to go. And obviously one could be a pluralist here. Maybe some psychological constructs are, as it were, only individuated internally, some might be externally. So it's not a case of one model fits all, but there is, for each construct, you can ask, or each type of construct maybe, where their environmental relations are constitutive of that construct. And then there's a knock-on question, which we touched on. How does that debate relate to questions of revising taxonomy? So one way to think about what some people are doing is they're requiring a mapping between brain taxonomy, neural taxonomy, and psychological taxonomy. That seems to buy into a kind of internalism. If you're an externalist about taxonomizing, then the one-one mapping is not necessarily a given. So that's one reason why this is important to methodology of cognitive or taxonomic revision. It's the second set of issues. The third set of issues that we talked about was how to think about novel constructs, how to interpret novel constructs. So one way to think about novel construct formation is to assume that it's theory bound. So terms get defined, novel constructs get defined by their role, their inferential role within a theory. So you want to know what so-and-so means by X, well, look at the theory, look at the inferential connections that talk about X plays. But some of what is trying to be done here is looking to define novel constructs in a relatively theory-free or theory-neutral way, being quietistic about theories and not being and not making a lot of theoretical commitments. So if that's the case, and one can certainly see the attraction of doing that, then how do these constructs get their interpretation? We didn't come up with any answers to that question, but we did, I think, agree that it's an important question to be addressed. And so, yeah, does anyone from my group, note takers, want to chip in? Things I left out?
I think you covered it.
Covered it? Okay. Do we want to move on to the other groups now, or just anyone want to react or respond to any of? We're making this up as we go along, Jackie.
Yeah, I think it will come up in
The other groups.
when we
Yep.
report. So it'd be good to leave that on the board.
Okay.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But maybe you want to tidy up the writing, make it more legible.
I'm not the one.
Okay, thank you. This is useful because some of the things we talked about were identical. We started from a different starting point. However, we were asking about issues surrounding the quality of taxonomies. So, how do you think about what makes for a better, what makes for a worse taxonomy, and what kinds of evidence you would find convincing, as it were, to make revisions to taxonomic categories. So organizing it in the way that Paul did in his talk for the various kinds of moves you can make in a taxonomy for lumping and splitting and tree jumping and branch jumping and all those things you can do. What specific kinds of evidence would count towards motivating those moves? And one of the things we came to in the middle of the discussion is a different sense of plural taxonomies that played a role in answering that question, where the taxonomies where there are psychological taxonomies, right? But there are also biological taxonomies, right? There are ways of individuating psychological phenomena and then ways of individuating biological mechanisms. And there are similar but also distinct issues at both of those levels. And then, of course, there's the issue not just of the mapping between those levels, but of what role evidence plays between the levels. Right? How is it that our taxonomic categorizations at the psychological level should change or inform the way we divide up mechanisms? And then the reverse. How is it that when we identify mechanisms, how should that play a role in changing or informing the categories that we have at the psychological level? So that's I think, a deeper relationship than merely mapping, right? Where we're putting things in correspondence. In this case, it really is a question of how the evidence works across those levels. And so some people thought that once you've identified a common underlying mechanism, even if there are apparently disparate psychological categories, that should be sufficient evidence for combining those categories. That's maybe a little bit too simplistic, as was pointed out, because there is a sense in which there are mechanisms that underlie, the same mechanism that underlies everything, something like Hegelian plasticities everywhere, right? So we have to be a bit more sophisticated than that. But nevertheless, there might be a sense in which once you've identified a mechanism at the right level that underlies categories thought to be disparate, then that might be evidence for putting the psychological categories into the same. And likewise, the opposite. Memory is our case in point here. Once you've identified mechanisms that differentiate between processes that have some at least superficial psychological similarity, that provides evidence for actually splitting the categories. So, and this sort of came up in general. So what role sort of anatomical evidence plays in grounding and grounding and justifying psychological categories. One point that came up in that regard was that you might think that explanatory power and especially explanatory depth favor mechanistic categorization, favor letting the psychological categories follow very closely the mechanistic ones, the mechanisms. It was, however, pointed out that there are some kinds of categories that are really unified by functional considerations, and they might still be useful, even though they're not necessarily, those functionals aren't going to unify across levels. Nevertheless, the functional categories can play a role in helping us understand how ideas at the same level fit together. And so that seems like a legitimate scientific role, even if it's not a strictly explanatory one. And then we certainly also came up on this question as well. This was, I'll confess, driven largely by my own preoccupations. So not everyone thought this was as big an issue as I am. But there's this issue as well for us, right? Which is, what exactly is up for grabs? What do we have to keep fixed to not go totally off the rails? How do we choose what to keep fixed? And to what extent, as we move forward on this, are we always constrained by theory in the way that Tim pointed out, right? Where typically novel concepts get elaborated in the context of theories to either extend them or to alter them to fit data. And to what extent can we actually, in a more theory-neutral way, if theory neutral is even fully possible, but come up with novel constructs for which then we would extend theories to cover. And I don't know the answer to that question, and Let's say our group wasn't clear on whether there's a real issue there, I would say. Some seem to think that, no, actually, this is just business as usual. You're always going to be a mixture of theory and data, and there's nothing new here. I'm not convinced that that's true, just speaking for myself. I think that some of these analytic methods may actually be giving us new epistemic tools that could drive concept change. So this might actually be sort of one of those moments where something genuinely new is happening. I don't know whether that's true or not, because I think it's a question worth considering. And what else do you think, Jack, that we need to cover?
We spoke about memory being a single term and whether it was useful to keep it as a single term or whether we should split it. And then we spoke about the usefulness of the concepts that we have in our taxonomy. And then the question came up, was useful to who, or what do we mean by useful, and how is that getting cashed out? And again, there obviously wasn't much of a consensus on that either, but there's that. And then, let's see, there's just a bit about data and theory. There's a data theory debate at the end, which should influence our reorganizing the taxonomy. Just trying to pull that.
Yeah, but I think one of the things that unified the discussion across the whole, well, not unified, but was the thread that ran through the whole discussion, was this issue of discriminability and what kinds of discriminability are appropriate in what circumstances, and you know, in terms of thinking about all these relationships at these various levels. Just because you can discriminate something doesn't necessarily mean in every case that that's going to be useful. And one question, by the way, and I know there's lots of work in the philosophy of science on this question, but it comes up here, I think, in a particularly pointed way, which is what kinds of usefulness count as legitimate? Right? Because there are folk kinds of usefulness that may, again, this kind of gets back to this, right? There are folk kinds of usefulness that may actually differ from the scientific or clinical kinds of usefulness. And insofar as usefulness, so pragmatic considerations, as opposed to more strictly explanatory ones, and especially multi-level explanatory ones. To what degree pragmatic usefulness considerations are always just placeholders for eventual scientific replacement with mechanism, and to what extent they actually always retain legitimacy. So that relates back to some very old debates in philosophy of science about instrumentalism and things like that. But it comes up here, I think. Elaborations from members of the group.
I guess, you know, in the context of the novel construct stuff, there was this question about the degree to which, you know, we can get away from the theory latedness of our observations, right? That
yes.
Our current ontology is kind of baked into everything that we've measured.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. And the question along those same lines of when we do those kinds of bottom-up analyses, what actually are our theoretical commitments? Like how much are we inheriting from the conditions under which we took those measurements? How much are we inheriting just from the enterprise in general? And then how much of this are we relying to when we do these kinds of analyses?
Okay, so at the end of the discussion yesterday, Owen, in his talk, had mentioned that you know, when we design scientific or any kind of taxonomy, it always comes. I mean, this is me paraphrasing, but it comes sometimes with certain blind spots. And so then the question becomes, if a pluralistic perspective is what we want as a corrective, what's the best way in which people from different disciplines may come together and interact to answer this question? I mean, clearly this was what this conference, the aim of the conference was. And one of the things that came out of how we can engage in more fruitful interactions is that within these individual taxonomies, I mean, the individuals who use them, you know, I mean, first of all, what is folk psychology? Is it a mixed ontology? Is everybody carving that up in the same way? it's important for the people who use that taxonomy to be conscientious about what the terms actually mean and if there's consistent use of the terms across the board. The same thing is true in scientific psychology. Some people thought that we've made progress in moving from talk about states, like memories, to talk about processes. But is something lost in that transition at all? That's one question. But scientific psychology, is process talk consistent across investigators in terms of how people deploy terms, in terms of how they operationalize those terms? Similarly in neuroscience, right? Which, I mean, I don't know where we're putting different things, but at any given, I mean, it's not above psychiatry, but now it is. But wherever, you know, at any given level, there are certain concepts that people are deploying, and people aren't often conscientious about the way that they're deploying those terms or the way that they're investigating those. And I think everybody here that is at this conference is in the camp that is very thoughtful about these things. And I guess the question is, well, you know, how do we move forward? And I think in individual disciplines, one of the comments was that the training should be that we train people to think more carefully about these things. And of course, you know, sometimes philosophers think that they are really great at this, and I'm not saying that they're not, but sometimes they have specific blind spots that they're not willing to admit to. And so there should be, the claim was that there should be within each of these disciplines some conscientiousness and some training of new investigators or new scholars coming in to be thoughtful about these things. Because if ultimately what we're trying to do is talk about how different taxonomies relate to each other, or devise a new taxonomy, we ought to be clear about what kinds of things we're actually talking about. So that's sort of a paraphrasing, and certainly didn't capture all the interesting and rich ideas that came out in our discussion. But Danny, do you want to add anything to it?
So there were the two other things that seem to have come up. The one was the way that a taxonomy gets its powers through its being used. And so different disciplines and different subgroups within those disciplines use their taxonomies to different ends. And so, I mean, one of the ends is through this interdisciplinary work that you deploy your taxonomy, but it's not the only time that a taxonomy is deployed. We saw the story of the DSM where this group gained enormous power through successful deployment of a taxonomy that you know was entrenched for 30 years and then has been overturned. So the notion that taxonomies aren't just conceptual structures, but actual practices that disciplines engage in was a thing that we sort of talked about with respect to both the training of how the taxonomy is used, but also in terms of the ways that taxonomies can vary in non-open ways, like not the ways that the taxonomy just as a listed structure would appear. And then there was a comment about there's the question of whether we want to revise a taxonomy. There's also the question of how you translate across taxonomies. So you can, when and how do you get to move a concept from one taxonomy to another? And what does it mean to take a concept out of its taxonomy and then place it in a different context? How is the meaning of that preserved, changed, or generated? I think were two of the other things that came up. And anyone else who has better memories than us is, I'm sure, welcome to our groups.
Well, so there was one thing.
Yeah, sure.
The thing that I took away most was this notion that we really need to give categories their due, right, and really respect them and really not oversimplify them, but also be willing to be critical of them once we've done that, right? So it's this balancing act of respect and criticism of categories, right? It's hard. That balance is a difficult thing to catch up.
So
Yeah, right.
I was interested when you said in mixed taxonomy. It was folk psychology and mixed taxonomy. And I was wondering, did you talk about any of the dimensions that you might be thinking about?
Well, I I don't know that anybody actually called it a mixed taxonomy. They said that it's not, I can't remember who it was actually. I don't know that he's still in the room. He might- Oh, there you are, yeah, sorry, I apologize, and I don't know your name. I can't, my perception and my memory are.
I was just saying that this is not a set, I mean, some people think that there's no such thing as a folk psychology, that, I mean, after 100 years of reading and science fiction and scientific literature that's infiltrated, people are just thinking about these in all sorts of ways. And even in philosophy, like lots of debates about what folk psychology is, and it's very different ideas, even amongst the people who want to defend it or get rid of it. Some don't think it's a theory at all, it's just a set of practices. And yeah, so it's not easy to say that there's this thing, folk psychology, and that we've gotten away from it. And even when we do think we've stepped away from it, often we're just reapplying the exact same concepts. And there was also a comment about that it is sort of a way of othering something that we're kind of dismissive and we're kind of moving away from. But sometimes lack of critical reflection on how we're still using those exact same categories to recategorize things that we think now are based on evidence. So that was kind of what I had in mind.
Oh, good. Yeah, and when I said mixed ontology, I just meant that I think some of the process talk has filtered back to the folk, whoever the folk are.
I mean, think about the way the Freudian stuff influenced the way everyone was thinking about their world, and then now, like, just the metaphors that we use and how it's been influenced by science, and that's how people talk about, I mean, brainstorming and all these sorts of things that are just pedagogical things that education people use for, you know, 3rd, 4th, 5th graders. That's clearly influenced what the folk think.
And I think the version of that that's happening now, the sort of Freudian thing that perfectly come out, terms like repression, and now get deployed in your normal course of things. What seems to be happening now is kind of a quasi-Buddhist influence on folk psychology. So mindfulness and meditative practices are actually changing the vocabulary people use routinely to talk about their mental states. And there's some scientific work on that, but not necessarily always very good scientific work on that.
Yeah, Bill?
So,
This is something I didn't think of soon enough to bring up, but on the idea, and it's relevant to other disciplines and informing, and that you've got to do something external. And there's Eric Heller is a professor of physics and professor of chemistry at Harvard, and he works on wave theory, and he's done lots of stuff about generating chemical stuff using quantum mechanics. But he also published a book a few years ago on how we hear music. And it's an amazing thing on looking at first the details of musical, how the vibrations work and stuff. Where, and it turns out there's stuff about where in the ear at different levels you can get things. And it seems to me that this sort of detailed scientific stuff about how waves work and how they can be picked up in various parts of the body and how the complicated interactions make a difference should be something that could connect very, very well to inform and help guide work using brain scans and stuff to find out about appreciating music. And the idea that you could do one without the other, or that you should just ignore the stuff that Eric Heller's been finding out, is ridiculous, in my opinion.
I guess that this gets back to maybe something that came up in your group about training. And I think there are some deep issues here in the academy in general, frankly. And it's not like we've made a mistake necessarily. It's just really hard. Because we, at the same time that we need specialized training and specialized knowledge, we also need the capacity to translate that across different disciplines, and that's just hard to do. You know, frankly, especially places like Western, but other places represented in the room, philosophers of science are often actually really well placed to do that. And so I'm hope that people will take up that challenge to an even greater degree than they do now. The ability to sort of read across disciplines. Just because the opportunities and pressures are different on philosophers than they are on lab scientists. It gives you a greater opportunity, a relatively greater opportunity to do that sort of work.
There's a I don't know if she's written it anywhere, but Pat Churchland used to say all the time, someone needs to do sort of interdisciplinary translational work in the mind sciences, and if they want to call themselves philosophers, fine. So, I mean, we talked a lot about institutions actually, and I mean, it's really important because, I mean, interdisciplinarity is just like kind of a buzzword at this point. And on the one hand, it's really, like we all admit, it's important. On the other hand, it just an uncritical melding of everything is not to be pursued, right? So it's, I mean, to a certain extent, it's just proximity, right? So since taxonomies are generated or in use, I can think of some instances that I've seen of, just institutional settings fostering different, fostering productive interaction, not through like brute forcing or dictating, you and you need to, do the thing right now, but just sort of, physical proximity of people allowing for productive use of interacting categories. And I mean, that's a really broad institutional thing, but it seems like an important one.
So there's one thing that maybe it did come up in other places, but I know it came up in a number of conversations with people over the last few days, which is models and what are the constraints on models. So particularly people have been talking about predictive coding stuff and what might be the constraints on predictive coding models. I think that's going to be a really interesting aspect of this as well. I don't know if I have very many sensible things to say about it, but
I just, one thing that I kind of do when we talk about interdisciplinary collaboration is, and maybe this is something that interests me because I have historical interest, is that there are a lot of taxonomies in science, and a lot of them had to be rethought at some point or another, and I think we do ourselves kind of injustice not looking at the history or contemporary taxonomies and just what counts as rethinking a taxonomy in chemistry or in physics or in the social sciences. Really, that's the hardest thing I struggle with in this case. Is what are we really after in our scientific psychology, and what are we really trying to change? And whether the neuroscience is a means to do that or an end that we wish to achieve with it. And I think that's one thing that the collaboration can speak to. Is it's nice to hear from people in, say, chemistry who have really gone through a revolutionary taxonomy modification in the past 60 years.
I also wonder to what extent we sort of have a unique problem from these other revolutions. So, to some extent, everyone is an intuitive physicist, but there's a point at which physicists say, well, actually, the world is, 11, 12 strings vibrating in space. And people say, all right, cool. I can't see that. But, if you tell someone that they don't really have a fear center in their brain, then, everyone says, well,
Not cool.
yeah, not cool, right? I mean, I have my own psychology that I have a lot of insight into. And so to what extent do we have problems where, of course it's lovely to have folk psychology existing alongside scientific psychology, and in principle they should be able to speak to one another and they have different purposes, but to what extent do we really need to be careful of how we're letting them sort of interact with one another? How is that unique in cognitive science as opposed to these other domains?
Yeah, it would be nice to have specific examples that we're could actually grasp onto to talk about, okay, this is a good way to revise our taxonomy, and this is a bad way to revise our taxonomy. And yeah, I think in the mind sciences, we're just not at that point yet. There's maybe a few examples, a shift away from phrenology, but there's...
I mean, there's the reflex arc around behaviorism.
Or maybe we should go back.
That was more like ontological nihilism.
Is that bad?
So one thing I wanted to just mention is this sort of, I wasn't in the same group, or was talking about that, but you know, in terms of power dynamics, I think one that didn't get mentioned much is the eclipse of behavioral research, and kind of like good old-fashioned like cognitive science, and you know the increasing kind of siphoning or apportioning of funds into neuroimaging and things like that. So there's this disagreement going on, you know, between Russ and Mike about whether you need to do things in a kind of top-down way. You need to codify our current atlas of constructs and tasks and test those. And then there's kind of Mike's, well, maybe we should just sort of throw that all out, two-dimensional reduction, and do things from the bottom up. But I think in a way, if the top-down approach is right, if we sort of have to refine our concepts in a way that's sort of pulled into psychology, and we don't really understand the brain except through behavior and through psychology, then you might actually think the kind of eclipsing of behavioral research will be a really bad thing, and sort of the wrong bet to place. So I just think that's another power dynamic that's worth mentioning.
I'm not going to replicate this exactly, but it was something that Owen said during the discussion about how Russ's, the cognitive atlas, and I mean, that if philosophers could do something similar to achieve a similar end, I mean, and we talked a bit about, you know, we could crowdsource, or, I don't know, Muhammad Ali said something, but whether or not those kinds of methods would work similarly. The hats are too that you're doing.
Right, I'd love to see that. I mean, we started the cognitive atlas by basically taking the indices of a bunch of psychology textbooks and writing down all the concepts, and then went from there to say, you know, how do you define them, how are they measured, how are they related. So there's certainly there's a Coma Model from the start. But I agree, that would be really useful.
Question. Do you have any feedback on how people use the cognitive atlas? Beyond anecdotal?
I think they mostly use it to find information about tasks. I don't think a lot of people are using it to, you know, understand the concepts or use it. I mean, a few people use it for data mining, but you know, I think most people are using it as sort of like a slightly more focused version of Wikipedia.
And actually, for the historians in the room, clearly there are other taxonomies, explicit ones in biology, in chemistry, obviously, but there are taxonomies of entities. Are there other instances of taxonomies of tasks leading up to the entities? I mean, that strikes me as potentially unique to the thing you're doing.
At Buffalo, they have what they call the National Ontology Project. It's actually the philosophy department. It's Gary Smith behind it. So they've got things like ontologies for emotions.
Which they didn't happen to talk to anybody who knows anything about emotion.
Well, that's
the model of that center is basically, we know better than everybody else, we're going to go ahead and figure out the ontology of this domain. Sorry, I feel burned, but...
No, you're absolutely right. It's basically, I've looked at their emotion ontology, it's basically folk psychology of emotions, which we should take as a good ontology, but it's interesting that they did it at least. There are a bunch of other things involving psychological processes, also pretty ignorant of psychology, but it shows there's a methodology there. They think that the way to do it is to define things using logical formalism, which I have some doubts about. But at least that's one attempt you might look at to see how it can be done, probably badly.
Yeah, I guess I wondered, specifically in another science, historically, there was an instance where people wanted to try to formalize not just the entities they think they're studying, but also the processes by which they study them, so the experimental procedures and things like that. And try being explicit the way that Russ is trying to be explicit about what is it that this particular test measures. Maybe it's all implicit in things like chemistry.
Yeah, I was just looking around here, and it's actually surprising. I don't know about it. It'll say, ontologies of, biological techniques, and I just immediately browsing can't find any. It's a really interesting point.
Well, I mentioned it during our discussion that the ASSC, the Association for Scientific Study of Consciousness, some members have been discussing the possibility of having some sort of like glossary that ties terms to certain experimental procedures, because there's a lot of controversy about whether when people say that they're testing for unconscious perception, if it's really what they're testing for instance. So at least in that field, there is some discussion about like linking certain concepts that are being tested for with particular experimental procedures.
On another side you were talking about, I can give you a little bit in Newton explaining the motions of the planets with centripetal forces. So this is a concept he introduces, a theoretical concept at the beginning of Rethinking. Now one of the things that it turns out, if you have a body moving around a center and it's maintained by a centripetal force, and that's all it's operating, and it will move, if it's an inverse square force, that's the variation of distance, it's inverse square. Then it'll move in an ellipse. It'll go around and around in the very same ellipse. If it's falling off faster than the inverse square, you have forward precession of the orbit. And if it's falling off less fast than the inverse square, you have backwards precession of the orbit. So he's got a concept, and it's a kind of power, this idea, but he's got a way of getting features of it from the motions of bodies in a very systematic way. You're actually measuring the inverse square variation from the behavior of the orbit. And you can apply it to planets where you have precession that's due to interactions. You get rid of all the precession due to interactions, and if you got 0 left over, then that's another measure of the inverse square for gravitation towards the sun. And of course the famous Mercury perihelion, well I won't go into more. But there you have, right at the beginning of modern physics, you have exactly this idea of the power of the force, or the thing that's making the thing happen. And you have features that allow the behavior to measure the thing that you're postulating.
So also, if you're interested in specifically a taxonomy of techniques, I think if you look at the kind of pedagogical materials that would have been published in the 19th century, for instance, an area I know fairly well is geology. Like Lyell would write handbooks that they would consider to be pedagogical materials because, so he had a very specific theoretical view about what was going on geologically, and he had a very specific view about how you would test for that methodologically, and he partially to kind of promulgate his view would write books on how all these techniques and where they would be problematic and where they wouldn't be problematic. And that's something approaching a taxonomy of scientific methodology, if that's what you mean by a taxonomy of processes. He's also, trying to do something also kind of processes in terms of geological processes and not simply the entities that result thereof. Maybe that's because it's a hard science in a similar way, in the sense that it's historical and these things are difficult to get to and difficult to access, and you have to be somewhat lucky to find a fossil.
Yeah, the observables are historical.
Yeah.
In a certain way. But it's the same kind of accessibility as psychological observations.
Yeah.
This is like a slightly different thread, if that's all right, but I guess I was thinking over the past couple of days about individual differences in mental processes and even brain structure, and how that complicates the taxonomizing, because there are lots of things that are generalizable across like large parts of the human population.
very much reflects cognition and very much reflects its environment. And, you know, like if you become an expert in something and do it for 20 years, your brain is just going to be different from someone else's, and your mental processes are also going to be different from someone else's. And so, like, how do you account for these things when you're doing a taxonomy? Does it mean that you have to? Anyway, maybe I'll just leave it there.
Well, I mean, in fact, essentially, there's a whole tradition in psychology of sort of like what's called differential psychology, which used, basically measured people across a bunch of things and used the presence of those individual differences to actually infer what the taxonomy was. So, apart from it being a problem, that was like the basis for building the taxonomy. It kind of failed, but I think it mostly failed because, there's so many ways to do the analyses that you never come up with like a unique, you can always rotate the data and find a different taxonomy.
The personality psychology.
Yeah, exactly.
Case in point.
That's right. I guess I was thinking both about expertise cases and lesion cases, but also cases where like people are born with or without certain, other not necessarily neural, abilities. So, for example, if you're born blind, but there's lots of studies into it, right? Like we seem to know and be fascinated by these kind of different ways of building up systems, but I find it actually curious that we haven't had more trouble incorporating them into the taxonomy, given exactly how challenging they are for thinking about minds holistically, right? Because studies on people with visual impairment lead people to say, oh, well, maybe it turns out that visual processing isn't just about like visual stimuli, it's about spatial processing or something like that. But how can we conclude that? I guess it's partly the philosopher, like, can we conclude that? Or really is it the case that the system has totally adapted and it really is performing a different function for that individual than it does for someone with vision? Maybe it's just that the structure happens to be good enough for spatial reorientation or something, I don't know. I guess that's the thought.
Well, I think in cases like that, the question, can we say these are different, is we test it. We actually demonstrate whether these things are or aren't different. We essentially put the concept out there and let it be evaluated. I think that's really what I get at for, especially like this pluralistic idea of the distinction between folk psychology and scientific psychology. I think if you're going to elevate something from folk psychology to scientific psychology, it should, graduate in the sense of being demonstrated. It should be defined in such a way that it makes clear predictions that can be tested. It should be falsifiable. And it's not until that point when it has been demonstrated and demonstrated to be reliable that it should actually be accepted. And that's something I don't think is the case right now. And I think it's kind of underlying this whole issue of why we are evaluating these things in the first place.
So I know people probably want to grab some lunch and have planes and trains and automobiles to catch. Before we go, if I can ask you both a general and a specific favor. The general favor is please don't let this just fade in your memory. So do whatever your individual differences dictate to try to consolidate and capture this. And it's going to be different for everybody, right? What you come away with. But please at least try to come away with some things. The specific favor is, and remind me, there's an email address that you'll be using. Could you write it on the board so people have it? So as you come across relevant literature, but in particular as you write relevant literature, please send pointers to the email that's going to go up on that. And we will, as you probably already know, on the Rotman website, we have a list of relevant literature already, and we're going to try to maintain that just as a kind of community building exercise. So there'll be a reference, hopefully a growing reference for on this general issue.
Yeah. And just one final thing we need to do. My name's on the committee, but I didn't actually do any of the work, and Mike and Jackie did all of the work, so we should thank them for
Thank you all so much for such a productive. Enjoy lunch.